God always restores. That is not a motivational slogan. That is a pattern written into almost every major story in Scripture, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But here is the part nobody talks about. Restoration in the Bible almost never comes the way people expect it. It almost never comes when people expect it. And in almost every case, there is something that has to happen first. Something specific. Something the person often doesn't realize they're doing before the door of restoration opens. Job got back twice what he lost. But read the verse carefully. It doesn't say God restored Job after Job had suffered enough. It doesn't say God restored Job after Job had prayed hard enough. It says God restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends. That's the verse. That's the sequence. Forgiveness first, restoration second, always in that order. Peter was restored. But it happened beside a charcoal fire, the same kind of fire where he had denied Jesus 3 times. The same smell in the air, the same setting. Jesus met Peter not just with forgiveness, but at the exact point of failure. He didn't erase the past. He redeemed it. Samson got his strength back. But nobody was watching when it happened. His hair grew back in a prison quietly while the Philistines celebrated. They didn't even notice. The restoration was already underway before anyone recognized it. There is a pattern here. And if you are waiting for God to restore something you've lost, a relationship, a dream, a season, a version of yourself, you need to understand how this actually works, because the sequence is not random, and the timing is almost never what you choose. But it is always purposeful. Before we go through the pattern, I need to establish one principle. Without it, everything else sounds like a formula. And restoration is not a formula. The principle is this. God restores people, not positions. This is the mistake most people make when they're waiting for restoration. They're focused on the thing that was lost, the job, the relationship, the reputation, the financial standing, and God is focused on the person who lost it. Because here's the reality. If God restored the position before he restored the person, it would destroy them, or it would corrupt them, or it would become the very thing that holds them back from what he actually wants for their life. Look at Job. God didn't restore Job's wealth and then deal with his heart. He dealt with Job's heart, 42 chapters of wrestling, questioning, and eventually encountering God in the whirlwind, and then restored the wealth. Job, who received the restoration, was not the same Job who lost everything. He was someone who had been to the edge of his own understanding and found God there. Look at Peter. Jesus didn't hand Peter back his role as the leader of the disciples and say, "Don't worry about the denial." He met Peter at the charcoal fire, the same smell, the same memory, and asked him 3 times if he loved him, one for each denial. Not to punish Peter, to heal him. To override the memory not by erasing it, but by replacing each denial with an affirmation, each betrayal with a commission. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The restoration of Peter's role came after the restoration of Peter's heart, always in that order. So, when you are waiting for God to restore something, keep that principle close. He is not slow. He is building the person who can hold what's coming. Here is the first thing the pattern shows us. And it is the most counterintuitive one on this list. In the Bible, restoration almost never comes through the completion of suffering. It comes through the act of forgiveness. This is the Job principle. And it is the clearest example in all of Scripture. Job lost everything, his children, his wealth, his health, his reputation. He sat in the ash heap while his skin was covered in sores. His 3 closest friends arrived, and for 7 days they sat in silence with him. That part was good. Then they opened their mouths and spent 37 chapters telling Job that his suffering was his fault. They were wrong. God said so directly at the end of the book. God turned to Eliphaz and said, "My anger burns against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." And then God said something that should stop us cold. He told the 3 friends to go to Job and have Job pray for them. The people who had judged him misrepresented God to him, twisted his suffering into accusation. They needed Job's intercession. And here is the verse that changes everything. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. Not when his suffering reached a certain threshold. Not when he had learned enough lessons. Not when God decided enough time had passed. When he prayed for his friends, the restoration was on the other side of an act of forgiveness toward the people who had made his suffering worse. That is not coincidence. That is the pattern. Now, think about what this means for you. Is there a person in your story, someone who made your pain harder, someone who judged you when you were already down, someone who walked away when you needed them, that you are still holding? Not necessarily an obvious bitterness. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's the way you go silent when their name comes up. The story you still carry about what they did. Job 42:10 connects the dots clearly. Restoration followed forgiveness. Not forgiveness followed restoration. The diagnostic question here is not, have you suffered enough? The question is, who are you still not praying for? The second thing the pattern shows us is this: God almost never restores from a distance. He meets you at the exact point of your failure. The same setting, the same circumstances, the same smell in the air. Peter's story is the most precise example of this in the New Testament. The night Jesus was arrested, Peter followed at a distance to the courtyard of the high priest. It was cold. Someone had lit a charcoal fire. Peter stood by it to warm himself. And there, by that charcoal fire, a servant girl looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Peter denied it 3 times, cursing and swearing by the 3rd time, saying, "I do not know the man." Now fast forward to after the resurrection. Jesus appears on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The disciples come in from fishing, and John records something that most readers skip right past. He mentions specifically that there was a charcoal fire on the beach. This is the only other time in the entire New Testament that the Greek word for charcoal fire appears in the same gospel. Same author, used twice deliberately. Jesus chose that setting. Not an upper room, not the temple courts. A charcoal fire on a beach at dawn. The same smell in the air as the night Peter had said, "I do not know the man." And Jesus asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" One for each denial. Not to punish him, not to rub it in, but because healing requires returning to the wound, not avoiding it. Peter did not receive his restoration by pretending the denial had not happened. He received it by sitting in the same sensory environment where it had happened and being asked the same question, this time giving the right answer. Each of Jesus' 3 questions didn't erase a denial, it transformed it. By the end, the same setting that held Peter's worst moment had been overwritten with something new. 3 affirmations, 3 commissions. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. What this means for you is significant. The area of your life you most want to avoid, the season, the memory, the failure you would prefer to never revisit, that may be precisely where God intends to meet you. Not to reopen a wound, but to heal it in the only way a healing actually works. At the source. You do not need to manufacture this, but you do need to stop running from it. The third thing, restoration grows quietly while no one is watching. This is the part of the pattern that gives me the most hope and the most patience. In Scripture, God's restoration often begins long before anyone can see it. It grows in the dark, in the hidden places, while the world is looking elsewhere. Samson is the example here, and his story is one of the most human in all of the Old Testament. Samson was given an extraordinary gift, a calling marked by a Nazirite vow from birth. His strength was tied to that vow, symbolized externally by his uncut hair, and he threw it away. He fell for Delilah's manipulation. He told her the source of his strength. His hair was cut. His strength left, and he didn't even know the Lord had departed from him. The Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They brought him to Gaza, chained him with bronze shackles, and put him to work grinding grain in a prison. The man who had been a judge of Israel for 20 years, grinding grain, blind, imprisoned, a spectacle for his enemies. And then comes one of the most quietly powerful sentences in the entire book of Judges. You could miss it if you're reading fast, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. That's it. No announcement, no trumpet, no vision. Just a quiet biological fact slipped into the middle of a story about defeat, while Samson was in prison. While the Philistines were celebrating, while everyone had written the story as finished, God was not finished. The restoration was already underway, growing in the dark in a place where none of Samson's enemies were paying attention. By the time they brought him out to be their entertainment, the strength had already returned. They didn't notice. They were still celebrating a victory that was in the process of being reversed. There is something profoundly important here for anyone in a season that looks finished. The evidence of restoration is often invisible at first. It grows in prison. It grows in the dark. It grows while people who counted you out are celebrating. The Philistines would have kept shaving Samson's head if they had understood what was happening. They didn't understand because they couldn't see what God was doing in the hidden place. What is growing in your hidden place right now? What is God quietly restoring in you while the world looks elsewhere? The fact that you cannot see it does not mean it is not happening. The hair grows whether or not anyone is watching. The fourth thing, restoration almost always comes with more than what was lost. Now, here is the part that is easy to misunderstand, so I want to be careful. In Scripture, restoration is not always a straight return to what existed clear as throat before. It is often a deeper version, a wider version, a more significant version. Job received twice what he had before. 14,000 sheep instead of 7,000, 6,000 camels instead of 3,000. But he did not receive his original children back. He received new children. And there is a bittersweet quality to that, which any honest reading of Job has to acknowledge. He lived 140 years after his restoration, and he saw 4 generations of his descendants. The latter days of his life were blessed more than the beginning. But the grief of what was lost did not simply disappear. This is why the promise of restoration is not the same as a promise that everything goes back to the way it was. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. What God promises is not sameness. He promises something better, and better is defined by Him, not by us. The principle in Isaiah 61:7 is stated plainly. Instead of your shame, there shall be a double portion. Not the original portion, a double portion. But the double portion is given in exchange for the shame. It does not pretend the shame did not exist. This is worth sitting with. If you are waiting for God to restore something specifically to the form it took before it was lost, that may or may not be what comes. What you can trust is that what God restores will be sufficient, that His faithfulness in the latter days will not be less than His faithfulness in the earlier ones. And often, not always, but often the very things that were stripped away become the foundation of something stronger than what existed before. Joseph was not restored to being a shepherd in Canaan. He was elevated to second in command of Egypt. The magnitude of the restoration was entirely unlike anything he would have designed for himself. It required everything he had been through to be large enough to hold it. What you lost may not be what you get back. What you get back may be something you do not yet have the categories to imagine. I need to say something carefully before I close, because this pattern can be misused. The pattern of restoration is not a transaction. It is not a formula where you perform the required steps, forgive someone, return to the place of failure, wait quietly, and restoration is automatically delivered. That is not how God works. And if that is how you approach this, you will end up more confused and more disappointed than you started. The pattern reveals what God's restorations tend to look like. It does not give you a mechanism to control the timing or the outcome. Job did not pray for his friends as a strategy to get his wealth back. He prayed for his friends because God told him to. And because after 42 chapters of wrestling with God, he had become the kind of man who could. Peter did not sit by the charcoal fire and answered Jesus' questions as a performance of contrition designed to regain his position. He sat there, grieved and raw, answering from whatever was honest in him. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. He had no resume to offer, no promise of future faithfulness, only the knowledge of the one who knew him better than he knew himself. Restoration in the Bible is always an act of grace, not an earned outcome. The pattern shows you what grace tends to look like in motion. It does not give you a lever to pull. So, let me bring this together. If you are waiting for God to restore something, if there is a loss in your life that has been sitting there, heavy and unanswered, here are the questions that come out of the pattern. Is there someone you have not forgiven? Not because forgiveness will guarantee your restoration, but because it may be the very thing your heart needs before it can receive what's coming. Job prayed for his friends. He could not hold his bitterness and his restoration at the same time. Is there clear's throat a place you have been avoiding, a memory, a setting, a version of yourself that God may be asking you to return to? Not to relive the failure, but to let Him meet you there. Are you looking for visible signs when God may already be working in the hidden place? Samson's hair grew in the prison before anyone celebrated. The restoration was already on the way before it was visible. And are you holding a picture of what restoration is supposed to look like so tightly that you might miss the version God is actually building? Those are not easy questions. They are the questions that come out of the text. The morning after Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes. Scripture does not give us the exact moment it happened or the exact sequence of events. It simply says, after he prayed, it came. The morning after Peter affirmed his love 3 times beside a fire that smelled like failure and grace at the same time, he was given a commission that would shape the next 2,000 years of history. The morning the Philistines brought Samson out to entertain them, thinking they had won, thinking the story was over, he placed his hands on the pillars of the temple of Dagon and prayed one final prayer. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. What they did not know was that he had already been remembered. The hair had been growing in the dark for weeks, quietly, without announcement, without anyone watching. If God is restoring something in your life right now, it may already be growing in the dark. It may already be further along than you can see. Stay faithful in the waiting. Forgive what needs to be forgiven. Return to the places you've been avoiding. Trust the one who works in hidden places. The restoration that is coming may look nothing like what you lost. It may be larger. It may be different. It may arrive in a form you would never have designed for yourself. But if the pattern of Scripture tells us anything, it is this: God does not abandon what He started, and what He restores completely.